Hey, welcome back. And in this section of the video series, we're going to move into the more finer detailing of this image. So we're going to actually be hand placing assets and just making individual sections look really good on their own. So let's get started with this. So at this part of the process, I've gotten most of the main detailing all situated. So now I'm just kind of going through my asset library and just finding assets I want to hand place around the scene, just some like smaller details and things just to kind of break up the repetition of kind of all those essential details that I have so far. So as you can see, I just put in a tree. I just changed the color of the leaves to make it yellow, just to kind of break up some of that green that is throughout the entire image. In here, I was kind of thinking it'll be kind of cool to add a bunch of kind of greens, yellows, and maybe some reds as well. So that's kind of the direction I'm thinking right now as I'm placing assets. So really this part of the process too, I'm not usually like 100% sure what assets to use. I just kind of look through my library, and if something stands out to me, then I import it, try it out. If it doesn't work, then I just delete it and try something new. So I kind of find it's kind of helpful to just not really think too hard. Like if you try something and it doesn't work, that's perfectly fine. You could just try something new afterwards. Like that's the worst that's going to happen. So even if I'm not sure that it will work 100%, but I think it might possibly work, I'll just try it out. And if it doesn't work, then whatever. So basically I'm just kind of like looking through empty areas, importing things, rotating it around, and kind of just staring at the image, and if it doesn't sit right, I just will delete it just like I did right there. So now I'm also looking in the background, and I'm noticing just the ground is just very empty, as you can see in the background. So I'm just creating a quick vertex group, and I'm going to actually start scattering some ferns, pretty much just all over those ground sections, just so it doesn't look so flat and empty. So I just created a basic vertex group, and I'm just kind of scaling those up now. So now there's going to be ferns kind of scattered all along there, just to add a little bit more complexity to the ground level area. So here I'm not really too concerned about like the exact seed or placement of these. I'm just kind of doing a somewhat dense fern scatter system just to kind of add some complexity to that ground. That's basically all I'm using that for. So here I'm just adding some rocks underneath the water. So you may or may not really be able to tell that this is here unless you actually just like fully zoom in. And also by the time this image is done, you might actually even be able to see these rocks underneath the water. But I'll just put these down here just because there's a lot of times where when I don't, you can kind of see like the flat kind of ground texture underneath the water. So I just kind of put those underneath here just to kind of add some depth just in case, because sometimes it works out really well. So here's a rock cluster that I put together a while ago, and this is one thing I really like to do with pretty much all my rivers is just kind of use rock clusters and place them around the river edges just to kind of break up that kind of straight flat seam that you see between like the grass texture and the water that just looks very unrealistic. Adding these rocks and also other details like bigger rocks and like foliage and stuff like that along those seams just really kind of helps add the natural look to it. So right now I'm just kind of adding some rocks pretty roughly and kind of randomly. I'm not really focused too hard on making it look perfect just because this is going to be far away. There's going to probably be some volumetrics and then like some other assets covering a lot of this detail anyways. So you won't really be able to tell too much. This is just kind of like background detail at this point. But generally for like scenes where the river is a lot closer to the camera, I will spend a lot more time just kind of hand placing every individual piece and just making sure everything is perfect, and also placing a bunch more kind of like assets in between there as well. So yeah, I'm just kind of going through randomly rotating these and scaling a bunch of assets individually too. So about to crop out the bottom section just to help out with the render time. Although it does render out in pretty much real time. I have a 3090 which renders really quickly, but avoiding rendering the entire image when I don't need to still helps out and makes things a little bit more responsive as well. So I'm just kind of going through my asset library, and I mentioned earlier that I want to add a lot of kind of oranges, yellows, and reds. So I'm just kind of looking through my asset library for, plants with those colors. So like those red flowers, the orange and yellow shrubs, and just placing those around the scene in areas where I think there should be that kind of color distribution, or there's too much green or something like that. And also, as I mentioned earlier too, I'm not really putting too much thought into the placement of things. I just kind of go with kind of what feels right that second, and I don't really think about it. I just kind of try it out. If it doesn't work, I'll try a new area. And I find that just works best because when I think about things too hard, I feel like I just kind of, I guess, overthink. And when I'm overthinking about how to place things, then it ends up not being the correct choice. So whenever I just kind of go with what first pops into my head, usually that's the best choice. So you just saw I put a big rock right there, and one of my favorite things to do is place a rock like this that looks really nice and then surround it with other nice plants kind of like peeking out from behind and some kind of overlapping in front of it, which I'm probably going to come back to this later because I only added a couple assets around that, but usually I'll add some like sticks kind of leaning onto it, some like plants in front of it, and then some bigger ones as you see like the weeds and that shrub behind it just kind of peeking out. So I just find that looks really good. That's just kind of like a personal thing that I love to do. Also, as you can see, I started doing a little bit of framing on the bottom section of the composition on the foreground near the camera. And you can also see there's that flat kind of slanted rock kind of leaning inwards towards the right. And this is something that I like to do in a lot of my foregrounds. I don't do it in every image, but if you look at my past renders, you'll probably see that I do actually do that quite a bit. It's just something that looks really good in my opinion. I don't know why, I just really like to do that. So when I can, I usually do. So you can also see now, I'm just starting to hand place some rocks around the foreground pathway. And as you can see too, I kind of follow the angle in a lot of the rocks too. So you can see how the path is kind of slanted inwards towards the center of that path. A lot of times when I'm placing rocks too, I kind of like to slant that rock inwards along with the angle of that pathway too. I feel like it just looks really good too. It just kind of helps kind of keep that kind of slope of the path, helps guide your eyes down the pathway as well. And I just think it kind of also blends in really nice too. So that's one thing that I do a lot of times when placing rocks around my paths, but I also do randomize the rotation too sometimes. So I don't always follow that because sometimes I do want to break up that repetition, but that is just one thing that I do feel looks really nice when placing rocks. So I'm also going through placing sticks around too. So there's one thing I always do with my paths and my rocks too is I'll place the rocks around and then I'll just put like twigs and sticks and logs just kind of leaning on those rocks. I always feel like that's something that looks really good too. So I just pretty much do that in most of my paths as well. I just go through my stick library, kind of find a rock that just kind of feels too empty, and then I'll lean like a stick on it or something like that, and probably also put some weeds in front of it too, just to kind of add some extra complexity and, you know, break up some of that emptiness in certain areas. So here I'm also working on some of that framing on the composition. So I'm just kind of like adding some weeds and plants and shrubs just kind of like on the right and left side of the image in front of that rock on the right side too that I mentioned. And just kind of trying to make this whole section look really good when you zoom in. And when I'm detailing too, I like to zoom in really close and just look at the image. And if it just feels empty in a certain place or just something feels wrong, I'll just start moving things around, trying new assets, and just try to make it feel right. So I always recommend just zooming in as much as you can and just stare at that one particular area and just try to detail that area until it looks really good by itself. And also here, as you can see, I'm starting to move some trees around outside of the camera view. So this is just to kind of block light. So you can see I'm actually moving the shadows around in the image by moving these trees. So this is another thing that I really like to do as well, is I use trees to kind of block light and create kind of controlled shadows. And the reason I'm doing this is just to kind of add more of like a natural lighting to the scene. And, you know, like if this was like a real scene, to the left of the camera where the light's coming from, there would most likely be mountains, forests, and like trees and lots of other things that would be blocking the light and adding shadows on the path. But since we're in 3D, just outside of this camera view is just infinite empty space, which doesn't create shadows or anything like that. So I just place trees around just to kind of fake that without actually having to create an entire environment to block that light. And I feel like trees also create really natural shadows as well. So here I actually combined all of the cliff rocks together so that I can actually use sculpting tools to just manipulate the entire shape as one. So I'm just using the grab brush to tug parts around and kind of just sharpen certain areas and the overall shape of this island in general. So I got that to look pretty good. It's a lot more pointy and kind of slim, and I think that was perfect. So now I'm just kind of going through my winter trees library, and I imported one that I think would look really good to be used as kind of like roots hanging out of the bottom of this floating cliff. So this is one thing that I always do for my floating islands is I just add roots, like giant roots hanging out of the bottom of the rocks. I just think that looks super cool. And I just stretched this out so it's a little bit longer and kind of just fits the overall look that I think I need. And I'm just kind of placing this through on like empty sections. And I don't want to see like the bottom of the tree. I just only want to see like the tips and like the branches. So it looks more like roots. So here I'm just creating a scatter system on the top of the floating rock. I only want these trees to be scattered on the grassy sections, so just on the very top. And the way I'm going to be doing this is using the elevation and slope control tools. So basically this is going to allow me to only scatter outside of the castle walls, but also not scatter on like the actual cliffs and like the sides of the floating island. So I'm just kind of like adjusting those settings just to kind of get those to line up right, as you can see. And then finishing off with like the overall density and like scale So continuing with the scatter systems, I'm actually creating a circle plane to actually place on the first kind of like step section of the walls so that I can actually scatter some more trees inside of the castle area. So for this, I'm using a different kind of tree. I'm actually going to start scattering some silver maples. And the reason I actually am doing these as opposed to more of the like small pine trees is I just kind of think that since it's like inside of the castle area where people are going to be living, I just kind of feel like it needs like some more like rounded trees. So like the deciduous trees kind of fit that feeling a little bit better, I think. So that was just kind of one thing that kind of came to mind as I was doing this. So I didn't really put too much thought into it. I just felt like I needed some more rounded trees to make this work better. All right, so now I'm just kind of going through my asset library and figuring out what kind of assets I want to start scattering around the castle because I need some greenery on the actual castle itself. So this is one thing I like to do with most of my castles is these very tall and pointy shrubs. I like to scatter them on all of the corner pieces that I can. So I'm just going through and finding all of those kind of like circular corner pieces you see on the castle, and I'm just placing these tall shrubs on top of it. So they're just kind of acting as like green spires, and I just think that looks really cool. It's kind of like a cool way to add those kind of, that more like pointiness to the castle without it actually being architecture, but foliage. So once I got done with that, I figured I needed to add some more kind of color to this as well, because as you saw before, we were adding a lot of like the warm color, like the reds, yellows, and oranges to the foreground, but we're kind of lacking that in the middle ground and the castle area. So I brought in this red tree, and I'm just starting to kind of place this around the bottom of the castle just to add a little bit more of that red color to the scene out there. So I thought that looked pretty good, and I actually brought in a white version as well, and I'm starting to scatter that on the top section too. And now I'm going through my hedge library because I actually modeled out these wavy hedges a couple weeks ago, and I haven't gotten to use these yet, so I was actually pretty excited to use these, and I just think it looks pretty good. So now, similar to like what I was doing with the pointy shrubs, I'm just kind of finding the areas on the tops of all of these kind of wall blocks that I can. So any of the flat areas, I'm placing these hedges just to add a bit more greenery and break up just that kind of constant blue and gray that we have for the castle, because there's just, I just feel like there's too much of just those two colors. I want to kind of add some greenery just to break up that color pattern. So kind of a similar workflow as I've been doing. I'm just trying to kind of keep things symmetrical. So if I do it on one side, I do the exact same thing on the other side, just so everything looks even and equal. So now moving on from the castle, I decided the cliff rock underneath it was kind of just too repetitive and rocky. So I needed to break up some of that rocky detail with some more greenery too. So I actually made this ivy generator earlier this month as well with geometry nodes. And I figured this would be a really good way to just kind of like add this nice kind of like blanket of green around the cliff rock. So as you can see, it's kind of got this nice layer of green, but it's not too much green. There's a lot of areas that are still empty, but also a lot of green areas too. So it looks pretty natural. Now what I'm doing too is I'm just going through my asset library and just trying to find some more plants as well to use. So we got this kind of like nice layer of green. So now I'm just kind of breaking up some more of that repetition of that as well with some more kind of like shrubs and just more hand placed detail. So I have these kind of like filler shrubs that I use in a lot of cases for just things like this, where they're just kind of really good assets to just place around like empty sections or corners or crevices that you just need to add some kind of green detail, but like nothing in particular really. So I just kind of place these in any kind of like empty section I feel like needs some more greenery. I'm not really doing this with too much thought as well. So kind of as I mentioned before, I just kind of am looking at this cliff rock in general, and if I feel like it just needs more green, I just duplicate this around and try to place it in a way that kind of merges together well. I also have this tree that I am using for the actual like framing of the image as well in the corners, as you can see. I decided it'd be kind of cool to have some of those trees kind of growing from this cliff rock too, because these trees have like this really kind of cool slanted shape, and I feel like it kind of looks like it's kind of growing off something anyways. So I got the idea to actually just start placing this around like the sides of the cliff rock too and have it growing from the sides, which actually I think looked really good, and I was pretty excited about that look. So now I'm just kind of sculpting a little bit more detail. I felt like the castle was a little bit too tall, or like the rock was a little bit too tall. So I just kind of squished that in with the sculpt tools, and then now I'm just kind of placing some of those assets back up to match back up with the new kind of area that this was sculpted to. So I decided I needed to actually move the entire floating castle in rock, because while the shape and design looked really good, I just felt like it just didn't feel big enough. It just kind of felt way too distant and small and just didn't seem as, I don't know, cool, I guess. So I figured I needed to actually select it and move it much closer to the camera to give it a much larger sense of scale and take up just much more of that environment and just seem huge in comparison. So I decided to move it forward and kind of pull it down a little bit. So now it covers up a lot more of that environment, but it just feels a lot larger and kind of like more like the correct scale that I was looking for. The castle looks huge, it takes up much more of the composition, and you can see much more of that detail as well. So now what I was thinking is adding some waterfalls would be really cool, kind of just coming down from like the top of the like floating rock. So I decided to actually duplicate the fog cube or the volumetrics cube and kind of shrink that down and scale that so that it kind of just takes up this bottom section near the floating rock. And the reason for this is I'm just going to be having some waterfalls falling down from the cliff rock and into the water below it. So there's going to be a lot of like mist and kind of like fog from that waterfall or whatever like waterfalls I end up putting in there. So this is just going to kind of help with that look as well, because I'm going to also probably put some kind of like clouds and kind of like noisy volume as well later on. So I decided to bring in one of my geometry nodes tools. This is just like this giant kind of procedural vine tool that I made. And I'm just kind of using this as kind of like bridges kind of just to connect this to the surrounding kind of like hills and cliffs. So this tool is based off of a Bezier curve. So basically this is really easy to use. It's just kind of like manipulating a curve. It's just that this curve has these giant roots growing from it. So I'm just kind of making these kind of like S shapes and just trying to find some cool kind of ways to connect this to the surrounding area. And I always find kind of making these kind of like S-type curves to be very interesting. I kind of do this a lot when I'm using these. And I decided to duplicate this, make it smaller, and start kind of placing some more of these vines around the scene. So I made a small version and I kind of kept the same shape and put this into the foreground. And I decided to kind of put this on the right side of the camera to help kind of frame the image and just kind of, I don't know, I felt like there just needed to be more vines. So I just started kind of experimenting with where I could put this and in what ways I could kind of position these to just add some more complexity and detail. I decided to also duplicate some and put some in the kind of distant river area as well, which helped a lot because it still is pretty empty back there. So I decided to kind of just put these in some of those areas that you can still see, just to kind of cover up some of those empty spots and make it look a little bit more detailed and interesting. So now I'm just selecting the volumetrics cube and I'm about to go into the shader editor and add a noise texture to this. The reason for this is I'm going to actually create these kind of like noisy patterns so they look more cloud-like. So some areas are going to have very minimal density and then some areas are going to be very dense so that it kind of just looks way more natural and kind of cloud-like. So as you see right here, I have a texture coordinate set to generated. And then that's going through a mapping node and a multiply and a length. So this is going to actually allow me to kind of have a circular fall off. I'm just translating this right now so I can move it to the center of this cube object. But as you can see, we have this kind of circular shape. So once I got the circular shape, I actually added a new multiply node, and connected to this, I actually added a noise texture. So I can actually use the noise texture to kind of just remove certain areas just based on the procedural noise. So I'm just kind of messing with like the scale, the detail, and just trying to find kind of like a cloudy look that I like. And as you can see here, I can use the W slider as kind of like a seed to kind of change the position of like where these clouds are, and also the color ramp to kind of crunch them in together, adjust the fall off and like the size of these individual clouds. So right here, I'm just kind of experimenting with kind of every different possibility, what types of clouds I want, how many I want, if I want them to be large, small, if I want just a couple, or if I want a bunch. And this part can be a little bit tricky because there's just so many different possibilities, but I kind of decided to keep it more subtle. Generally with like volumetrics and fog and clouds, I generally keep things pretty subtle. So I stuck to kind of keeping it more on the lower side of the image and also only just like a couple clouds and keeping it a little bit more minimal. So after that, I decided to start lighting the scene a little bit more. So similar to what I was doing in the foreground, I'm just moving some trees kind of in front of the sun so I can block some light on the castle so that it's just not evenly lit lighting throughout the entire floating island and castle. It just looks a lot more natural if there's some shadows and some variance in those highlights. So I just started duplicating those around, moving them into place and just kind of seeing where I wanted to get those kind of controlled shadows. And generally when I'm placing these, I want to kind of place them in ways where I can block lighting in areas I don't want you to look as much, and then keep lighting in the areas where I do want to kind of keep your eyes drawn to. So I do want the focal point to be very bright, and then some of the kind of like distant areas or like the side areas that are less important, I can kind of put shadows into to make it darker. And then a lot of like the side areas or areas away from the focal point, then I can also put shadows in there just so your eyes aren't attracted to that as much as the focal point. So here I'm just opening up my asset library again because I figured I needed a new tree to be on this kind of right side cliff. And I have this kind of like hanging willow tree that I made recently. And I decided this would be kind of perfect to hang off of the cliff because it's already it's kind of got that look where it's just kind of like hanging off something anyways. So I decided to try this out and I felt like it worked perfectly. So I was pretty happy with that result. All right, so that wraps it up for this section. So I hope you guys found this video helpful. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to NVIDIA Studio's YouTube channel so you guys can stay tuned for their future videos. In the next section of this video series, we're going to be covering the waterfalls. So basically how I create the waterfalls in this image and how you guys can do that as well. So I'll see you guys there.